Helen was born on the edge of a large forest reserve in Oregon. Her parents ran a small medical clinic that served both the nearby town and the rangers who worked in the national park. Their wooden cabin sat near the base of a hill where tall trees lined the property and wild animals were often seen passing through. Instead of playgrounds or shopping malls, Helen grew up surrounded by pine needles, cold streams, and the sounds of birds and distant wolves. As a child, she followed her mother on long walks through the trails. Her favorite part was stopping to watch the squirrels chase each other or the deer hiding between the trees. But the moment that changed everything came when Helen was 7. Her father took her on a trip into the deeper parts of the forest. A park ranger had reported a small group of gorillas had been spotted, part of a special research project to reintroduce rescued animals into protected areas. Helen was nervous at first. She had never walked so far into the woods. But she followed quietly, careful not to step on any dry branches. The ranger who led them signaled for silence. They stopped near a thick wall of trees, and that's when Helen saw them. A large male gorilla sat calmly under the shade, his dark eyes watching over the rest of the group. A few younger gorillas moved slowly behind him, curious and playful. One even picked up a stick and tapped it on the ground. Helen stood frozen, watching. She didn't feel afraid. She felt drawn in, like she was watching something sacred. The gorillas didn't roar or charge. They just moved quietly and peacefully. Helen didn't say a word the whole way home. But inside her, something had started. A deep interest. A need to understand these animals. To protect them. From then on, Helen spent most of her time learning about wildlife. She checked out every book she could from the town library. She started writing little notes in a notebook, drawing gorilla faces and reading about their behavior. She even asked her teachers if she could do school projects about primates, and most of the time, they agreed. Her parents noticed the change. They weren't surprised when Helen started helping out at the local animal rescue center. It mostly cared for injured raccoons, birds, and abandoned dogs, but it gave her a place to learn about healing and care. She cleaned cages, helped with feeding, and listened closely when the vet explained things. When high school ended, Helen was offered a full scholarship to a university in New York. She had top grades and was expected to study medicine. The offer was rare for someone from her small town. Her parents were proud. Her teachers congratulated her. But Helen was quiet about it. She didn't feel excited. She felt torn. She took long walks by herself, thinking it over. The scholarship could lead to a steady life in a city. A hospital job. A good paycheck. But her heart didn't point in that direction. It pointed back to the forest. To the calm eyes of the silverback she had seen years ago. To the feeling she had when watching animals heal and return to the wild. One evening she sat on a bench near the ranger station looking out at the trees. She remembered the promise she made to herself as a little girl. To help animals. To protect the ones that couldn't protect themselves. She didn't say anything to anyone right away, but she had made her choice. Instead of going to university in New York, she applied to a wildlife rehabilitation program in Northern California. It wasn't well known. It didn't offer fame or wealth. But it was close to another protected forest, and they had a small primate center where rescued gorillas from illegal private ownership or failed zoo transfers were brought for care. Her early tasks were basic. Clean cages. Wash food bins. Track feeding logs. But she paid attention. She stayed late. She asked questions. The lead caretaker noticed her commitment and started letting her sit in on medical checks and observe the animals more closely. It wasn't long before Helen was allowed to assist with rescues. That's when she saw the damage people could cause. Gorillas with broken fingers, rough scars, or signs of fear that didn't go away easily. Some had been kept in small cages for years. Some were too weak to stand. These moments didn't make Helen give up. They made her more sure she had chosen the right path. She didn't need a lab coat or a hospital office. Every time she saw a gorilla begin to trust again, begin to eat, begin to play, she felt like her life had meaning. And even though most people didn't understand her choice, Helen didn't care. She had found the place where she truly belonged. Helen didn't mind waking up early. Her days started before the sun rose, often with the sound of wind pushing through the trees outside her small room. The primate center was quiet in the morning. Just the hum of the lights turning on and the soft movements of animals waking up. She would walk through the gates with her bag slung over one shoulder and greet the staff already in the feeding area. Most mornings followed a routine. Clean water, fresh fruit, checkups, and notes. But Helen treated each day like it was new. She watched how each gorilla behaved. Some were shy, staying in the corners of their enclosures. Others were bold and loud, banging on the walls to show who they were. Helen never rushed. She moved slowly, kept her voice low, and gave each animal time to get used to her. She had learned early that trust could not be forced, especially not with animals that had been taken from the wild or raised in fear. Her favorite part of the day was the observation hours. Staff would sit in a quiet room behind one-way glass, studying how the gorillas played, interacted, and responded to different changes. Helen took notes, drew pictures, and asked questions to the lead caretakers. She wanted to understand everything, the small gestures, the way a mother picked up her baby, the way two young gorillas argued then made peace with a touch. The center didn't have a big team. Everyone had to do a bit of everything. Helen helped clean out sleeping areas, prepare medicines, carry boxes, and fix broken parts of the enclosures. Some days were long. Some days were dirty. But she never complained. She felt more alive here than she ever had sitting in a classroom. One rainy afternoon, a rescue call came in. A private owner in a nearby county had kept a young gorilla illegally in a cage behind his house. A neighbor had called it in. The center was the only place in the area licensed to take in primates like this, so the director asked Helen if she wanted to join the team. She said yes without thinking twice. The road was muddy and the trip took longer than expected. When they arrived, the scene was worse than she had imagined. The cage was too small. The gorilla sat hunched in one corner, his eyes dull and his arms tight against his chest. He had no food and the floor was soaked. It took almost an hour to convince him to move into the transport crate. He didn't fight. He didn't even make a sound. Back at the center, the medical team did their checks. The gorilla was male, likely under 2 years old, and underweight. He had several cuts on his hands, and his fur was patchy in places. Helen stood at a distance, watching through the glass as he sat motionless in his new enclosure. He didn't react to anything. Not the food, not the soft blankets, not the calm voices around him. He looked like he had given up. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about his eyes. Something in them stayed with her. She came in early the next morning and asked to take charge of his care. The staff agreed. She named him Bantu. At first, Bantu didn't move when she entered the space. Helen kept her distance. She cleaned, replaced food, and sat on the other side of the enclosure, reading her notes aloud softly. She didn't try to touch him. She didn't even try to make eye contact. She just wanted him to know she was there. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Slowly, Bantu started to shift. He began eating small bites of fruit. He watched Helen more closely when she came in. He moved to a corner closer to her side of the enclosure. One morning, she found a piece of leaf left near the bars, placed carefully as if it was meant to be seen. After that, things changed faster. Bantu began responding to her voice. He would sit across from her as she read, sometimes making soft grunts or movements. He still flinched at loud sounds or sudden movements, but his eyes began to brighten. Helen spent hours with him each day, learning what helped and what didn't. She never forced touch. But one afternoon, as she knelt to place new food, she felt a soft tap on her arm. She turned and saw Bantu holding out a piece of fruit to her. He looked at her, then gently dropped it in front of her. It wasn't just a gesture. It was trust. Helen smiled to herself and didn't move. She knew this was just the start. The real work would take time. But she had made a promise long ago to protect animals like him. And now that promise had a face, a name, and a future. The days that followed were steady but quiet. Helen spent most of her time near Bantu's enclosure. She didn't speak much to the others unless she needed to. Her focus was clear. Each morning, she brought new fruit combinations, tested toys made from safe ropes and wood, and made sure his space stayed clean and calm. Bantu responded in small ways, sometimes sitting closer, sometimes mimicking her movements. Other gorillas in the center still needed attention, but Helen arranged her schedule to give Bantu the extra care he needed. Some of her coworkers wondered if it was worth the effort. They didn't say it directly, but Helen could sense their doubt. Bantu wasn't like the others. He was quieter, slower, less open. But Helen didn't expect quick results. She wasn't there for progress charts. She was there for him. Then, one morning, something changed. Helen arrived early, as usual. The sun had just come up. The fog still hugged the trees and dew clung to the fence. She walked toward the enclosure with a bag of chopped fruit in her hand. But before she reached the gate, she heard a low sound. Not loud, but not a sound she heard often from Bantu. It was a short grunt followed by a soft shuffle. She paused. Through the fog, she saw him. Bantu was standing. Not just standing, but near the door, waiting. His body was calm. His eyes watched her closely. He didn't pace or turn away. He stayed there as if he had been waiting for her. Helen kept her movements slow. She unlocked the gate and stepped inside the safety area, placing the food in the bin. As she stood up, Banta took one step forward, then another. Helen stayed still. Banta walked until only the low divider stood between them. He looked up at her, then reached out. His hand didn't touch hers, but it hovered just over the edge. Close enough to feel the warmth. Close enough to say he remembered. Helen didn't lift her hand. She just sat down on the edge, letting him get used to her presence again. He stayed nearby as he ate, never turning his back. That afternoon, she noted it all down in the logbook. For the first time, she wrote the word trust in the margin. In the weeks that followed, Bantu's world opened up. He began to explore the upper parts of the enclosure. He showed interest in toys, sometimes pulling them apart just to see what was inside. He also responded to sounds, especially Helen's voice. Sometimes, when she was across the yard with another animal, he would watch her from a distance, his body still but his head slightly tilted. Like he was listening. He had moments of fear too. Sudden rainstorms made him hide. Loud construction sounds from outside the center made him curl into a corner. But Helen was always nearby. She would sit quietly, not asking for anything, just letting him know he wasn't alone. Late one evening, a new gorilla was brought to the center. A young female rescued from a small private zoo that had closed down. She was weak and stressed. Helen stayed with the medical team, helping with her first checks. She felt torn, she wanted to be there, but she also worried about Bantu, who would notice her absence. The next morning, Helen rushed back to his enclosure. She expected him to be withdrawn again. But when she arrived, Bantu was sitting by the door, calm as before. He looked at her and tilted his head. Then he stood up and walked to the other side of the enclosure, leaving space for her to come in. It was a quiet welcome. She stepped in and sat down. He returned and sat near her. They stayed like that for a long time. As Banta continued to improve, Helen knew a conversation would soon happen, one that came with every animal like him. The center had rules. Gorillas were not pets. They were not meant to live behind fences forever. If an animal became strong, independent, and safe for reintroduction, the goal was always to let them return to the wild. Helen didn't want to think about that yet, but she also knew she couldn't avoid it forever. For now, she focused on the small victories. Banta learning to swing from the ropes. Banta letting a caretaker feed him without hiding. Banta sleeping through the night without signs of fear. He was no longer the silent, broken animal they had brought in weeks ago. He was becoming himself again. And even though he didn't speak, his actions showed something stronger than words. Helen had saved his life. But he was teaching her something too. About patience. About quiet strength. And about what it meant to be truly seen. By the start of summer, Bantu had changed completely. His coat was full and clean, his muscles stronger, his movements smoother. He now climbed easily, swung across the ropes, and even played with water when the staff turned on the mist during hot afternoons. He had also started making low vocal sounds, not angry, not fearful, just soft sounds that filled the quiet space. To Helen, they sounded like peace. The other staff began to notice. One of the senior caretakers stopped by the enclosure during feeding and watched Bantu for a while. He didn't say much, just nodded and left. Another one mentioned how alert Bantu had become. There were fewer concerns in the daily reports now. His appetite was steady. His reactions were calm. And his connection with Helen remained the same. They had a rhythm. She would sit on the small bench near the sidewall. Bantu would walk across the enclosure and sit across from her. Sometimes they didn't even look at each other directly. But they always knew the other was there. Helen would talk softly while she sorted fruit or folded clean towels. She didn't expect him to understand every word, but she knew he listened. One evening, a group of school kids came for a tour. They stopped in front of Bantu's space, laughing and pointing. One of the boys tapped the glass hard. Bantu jumped back and hid in the corner. Helen was nearby and quickly asked the group to leave. She didn't raise her voice, but her face made it clear they had crossed a line. After the group left, she walked to the enclosure and sat down. It took a while, but Bantu returned to his usual spot. Helen knew then that even though he had grown stronger, some wounds still lived inside. As the weeks passed, the staff began discussing reintroduction. A new program in the Pacific Northwest had opened, offering large protected areas where certain gorillas could be slowly released and monitored. The forest was deep, the food sources were natural, and contact with humans would be limited. It was the kind of chance few centers ever got. Helen listened quietly during meetings. She nodded when they asked if Bantu was ready. She knew the truth. He was. But knowing didn't make it easier. Each night she stayed a little longer by his enclosure. She would sit until the sun dipped low behind the trees and the shadows reached across the ground. Bantu would sometimes press his hand against the glass just for a moment, then walk back to his resting space. It felt like he knew something was changing too. Helen tried to prepare him. She introduced him to more keepers. She stepped back during feeding. She stayed farther away during cleanings. But each time she walked past, his eyes followed. Not afraid. Not sad. Just aware. The transport date was set. A special team would come to take Bantu to the release site. The move would take a full day and Helen would not be going. The release team had rules and emotional attachment was considered a risk. Helen accepted that. But it didn't make the goodbye easier. The night before the move, she stayed late again. The center was quiet. The air felt heavier. Helen stood by the edge of the enclosure holding a small piece of fruit. Bantu approached as he always did. She placed the fruit on the ground, then sat down. Bantu didn't eat right away. He looked at her, then sat across from her. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, she stood up. She gave a small wave, then turned to go. Just as she reached the door, she heard a soft sound behind her. She looked back. Bantu had picked up the fruit and placed it near the glass. Then he stepped back and waited. Helen walked slowly back, knelt down, and picked it up. She didn't cry, not then. She just nodded once, then left. The next morning, she didn't go to the enclosure. She stayed in the office, listening through the open window as the transport team arrived. She heard the quiet hum of their truck, the careful voices giving instructions, and the final closing of the gate. When she stepped outside, the enclosure was empty. Helen didn't return to the yard that day. She walked instead toward the back field where the fence line met the trees. She stood there looking out. Somewhere in that direction, Bantu would find the forest again. He would climb real trees. He would taste wild berries. He would live free. She had saved his life. But he had given hers meaning. And now it was time to let him go. After Bantu left, the center felt different. The sounds were the same, birds calling from the trees, the clatter of buckets during feeding time, the soft growls and grunts from the other animals, but to Helen, something was missing. The space she had passed by every day now stood quiet and empty. The ropes hung still. The toys sat untouched. The bench where she used to sit stayed in the same spot, but she never sat there again. She tried to shift her focus. There were still animals to care for, new arrivals to check, and daily logs to update. A younger gorilla came in from a different rescue operation. He was loud, always moving, always pulling at things. Helen helped with his intake, made notes, and gave him attention. But her heart wasn't in it the same way. She smiled at the others. She did her job. But the bond she had with Bantu had been different. It wasn't something she could explain. It wasn't something she expected to happen again. Days turned into weeks. Then months. Sometimes she would look at the gate as if expecting someone to walk through with news. But nothing came. The reintroduction program sent one short report after Bantu's first month in the wild. It said he was healthy, adjusting well, and had made his way deep into the trees. He had shown curiosity about other animals and avoided humans, just as they had hoped. The report included no pictures. No names. Just facts. Helen folded the paper neatly and placed it inside her drawer. She didn't read it again. The seasons changed. Autumn brought cooler winds and falling leaves. Then winter came, covering the paths in frost. Helen worked through it all, wearing thick gloves and moving slower in the mornings. The cold bothered her more than it used to. Her knees ached some days. Her back didn't bend as easily. But she didn't talk about it. She kept her pace and finished every task. Her coworkers offered help more often now. Some of them had been at the center for only a few years. They looked to her for guidance but also noticed how quiet she had become. Helen answered their questions, gave advice, and trained new volunteers. But she spent more time in the office, less time in the yard. One afternoon, the director called her in. He asked if she had thought about taking some time off. A vacation. Maybe a short break. Helen just smiled and said she would consider it. But she didn't take one. Instead, she stayed late that night, walking slowly through the rows of enclosures. Most of the animals were asleep. A few looked up as she passed, their eyes blinking in the soft light. She paused by the old spot where Bantu once stayed. The enclosure had been cleaned and prepared for another gorilla, but for now it stood empty. Helen stood there a while, her hand resting on the wooden gate. The silence wrapped around her. In that moment, she felt something close to peace, but also something like longing. She knew she had done her part. She had helped raise and release one of the most difficult cases the center had taken in. She should feel proud. But she also felt the quiet ache of something unfinished. Winter slowly faded. The first signs of spring returned. Helen planted new herbs along the walkway just as she did every year. Small green shoots pushed through the soil and the air began to feel softer. She moved a little slower than before, but she was still there each morning, still holding the same bag of fruit, still walking the same path. There were no more reports from the release team. That was normal. They didn't send regular updates unless something urgent happened. Helen told herself that no news meant Bantu was fine, living the life he was meant to live. Free, wild, strong. But still, there were moments, early in the morning or late in the quiet hours, when she thought about him. Not just about how he looked or how he had grown, but how he had made her feel. How he had changed her. She had gone into that enclosure to heal him. But somehow he had healed something in her too. A part of her that she didn't know had needed healing. Helen didn't expect to see him again. That wasn't how these stories usually ended. Released animals rarely returned. The forest was vast. The chances were small. But even knowing that, she still looked toward the trees some days, wondering if he was out there. Wondering if somehow he remembered. Over the next few years, Helen stayed at the center, though her role slowly shifted. She no longer handled daily feedings or joined the rescue teams. Instead, she spent her time in the office, training new staff and helping with planning. Her body moved slower now. Her hands hurt when the weather changed. Climbing steps took longer. But her mind remained sharp and her love for the animals never faded. The staff respected her deeply. They often asked her for advice, especially when new rescues came in. Helen listened patiently and answered each question with care. She had seen things most of them hadn't, animals arriving nearly dead and somehow recovering. She had lived through long nights, medical emergencies, and difficult decisions. She never called herself an expert, but everyone else saw her that way. She rarely went to the enclosures anymore. Not because she didn't want to, but because it took more energy now. Her legs didn't like the uneven paths, and her hip often ached by the afternoon. She still walked the grounds from time to time, stopping by the fences and watching quietly. Some of the older gorillas recognized her and came close to the glass. She would smile and wave, then move on. The bench near Bantu's old enclosure remained in place. No one ever moved it, and Helen never sat on it again. She passed by it without speaking, though her eyes would sometimes rest there a moment longer. The enclosure had been used for other gorillas since Bantu left, but it had never felt the same. The bond they shared was rare, and Helen knew that. Her home was just outside the center grounds now. A small cabin tucked between trees, with a wide porch and a quiet view of the woods. In the mornings, she liked to sit there with a blanket and a cup of warm tea. Birds came often. Squirrels played in the grass. Sometimes deer passed by without fear. It was peaceful, and Helen was grateful for it. She had a small photo frame inside the house. It didn't hold a photo. It held a single page from the report she had received years ago, the one that confirmed Bantu had adjusted to the wild. The page was folded neatly and placed behind the glass. It wasn't for display. It was just a small reminder. A quiet piece of proof that he had made it. There were nights when Helen dreamed of the forest. Not just the trees or the sound of wind, but of movement, large shapes among the shadows, heavy steps, and deep eyes watching from the dark. She would wake up without fear. Those dreams didn't frighten her. They comforted her. One spring afternoon, a young staff member stopped by her porch with a message. A group of rangers had called the center. A gorilla had been spotted near the old river path, a place where reintroduced animals rarely appeared. The animal had not acted aggressive. It had stayed still, watching quietly before disappearing into the woods again. The rangers said it looked older, strong, with deep brown eyes and a calm way of standing. Helen listened, then nodded. She didn't say anything at first. The young staff member waited, unsure what to make of her silence. Then Helen stood up slowly, leaning on the porch rail. Her eyes looked toward the trees. She said it was probably just one of the many animals living free now. Nothing more. But after the staff member left, Helen stayed on the porch longer than usual. Her tea had gone cold, but she didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the path that led toward the forest. The next morning, she asked one of the caretakers to drive her to the sanctuary's main entrance. She hadn't been there in months. The gate stood tall and strong, covered in climbing vines. Beyond it, the trail curved into the woods. Helen walked to the gate and held the metal bar gently. She stood there for a while, listening. There were no strange sounds. No movement. Just the quiet hum of the forest. But something about the air felt familiar. She returned to her cabin slowly, step by step. That night, she sat on her porch again, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trees. She didn't expect anything. But she stayed up longer than usual. Just in case. The forest held many stories. Most of them stayed hidden. But sometimes the past found its way back. And Helen, even in her old age, still believed that some bonds were never truly broken. The morning started like any other. Helen woke early, made a small breakfast, and sat by the window with her tea. The sky was clear, and the soft light touched the tops of the trees. She planned to walk to the staff office later, maybe help sort files or check supply lists. But something in the air felt different. She couldn't explain why. It was just a feeling. Like something waiting. By late morning, she stepped outside and began her slow walk along the trail that led toward the sanctuary's edge. The ground was still damp from a light rain the night before. Birds flew between branches. A light breeze passed through the tall pines. Everything looked normal. Until the quiet broke. A loud thump echoed from the woods beyond the fence. Not sharp like a branch falling, but heavier. Followed by another. Then a pause. Helen stopped walking. Her heart beat faster, though she didn't move. She listened. The air was still again. She took a few steps forward and placed her hand on the fence rail. Then it came again. A third thump. This time closer. From inside the sanctuary, one of the staff members called out. He had seen movement near the far trail. Large shapes moving behind the trees. Not deer. Not bears. He couldn't tell what they were, only that they were big and quiet. The team gathered near the entrance. Radios crackled. Staff looked through binoculars and scanned the woods. No one panicked, but something was coming. They could feel it. Helen stayed by the fence. She didn't ask for updates. She just stood there, watching. Then the first figure stepped out of the tree line. It was large. Dark. Covered in thick fur. A gorilla. He walked slowly, not with fear but with calm. Behind him, two more shapes followed, smaller, lighter in step. And then one more. 4 in total. They walked to the edge of the sanctuary and stopped. They didn't make sounds. They didn't run. They just stood there, looking in. The staff kept their distance. Some were stunned. Others whispered guesses. Could they be returnees from the reintroduction program? It was possible, but rare. Gorillas released into the wild didn't come back. At least not like this. One of the caretakers turned to Helen. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward. She walked slowly, one hand on the fence for balance. The main gorilla didn't move. His eyes followed her. As she got closer, Helen stopped a few feet away. She looked up. His face was different now. Older. Broader. His eyes deeper. But something in them remained the same. She took a breath and stayed still. The gorilla stepped forward, just slightly. He didn't make a sound. But he lowered his head for a moment. Not a bow. Just a quiet sign of recognition. The staff stood back, unsure what to do. The younger gorillas behind him waited, calm and still. Helen placed her hand on the gate post and didn't move. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, as gently as he had arrived, the large gorilla turned. He looked at the younger ones, then back toward the trees. They followed as he walked away, back into the woods. No rush. No fear. Only one stayed behind. A small figure. Thin arms. Bright eyes. The youngest of the group. He didn't move right away. He looked at Helen. Then looked back toward the others disappearing into the forest. Helen watched as he stepped closer to the gate, only by a little. The staff opened the side entrance carefully. Helen didn't say anything, but her eyes told them to wait. The young gorilla walked slowly, unsure but not frightened. He paused near the opening. Then stepped inside. Just like that, the others were gone. The forest was quiet again. The boy had stayed. Helen turned away from the gate and walked back slowly toward the office. Her hand brushed the railing one last time before she let go. The others didn't need to ask. They had seen it too. The one who led the group had come for a reason. And the young one he left behind was now part of something bigger than any of them could explain. And somewhere in her heart, Helen knew. He had remembered. The young gorilla settled into the sanctuary without much trouble. He didn't fight or hide. He didn't scream or panic. At first, he stayed in the corner of his new enclosure, quiet and watchful. But there was no fear in his eyes. Just curiosity. He ate when food was brought. He played gently with the cloth toys. He responded calmly to the caretakers who cleaned and fed him. There was something different about him, like he already knew this place. Helen visited him every day. She didn't go inside the enclosure. She just sat nearby, watching. The others had started calling him Tiamu, meaning gentle, in one of the local dialects. The name fit. He never acted wild or loud. He moved with care, always aware of his surroundings. And he always looked toward Helen when she arrived, as if he expected her. One afternoon, a caretaker mentioned something strange. The new gorilla, Tiamu, had a small scar on his arm, faint but noticeable. Helen asked to see it. When she leaned closer to the glass, she saw the mark. It wasn't fresh. It had healed long ago. A simple line across the lower part of his arm. She didn't say anything right away, but inside, something clicked. She remembered Banta had a scar just like that. From the first week he arrived when he caught his arm on the corner of a broken crate. The scar had stayed there even after he healed. Could it be the same? Could TMU be Bantu's offspring? The timing made sense. The age lined up. And the way the older gorilla had come and left TMU behind, calm and sure, it felt like a choice. Not an accident. Helen didn't bring it up with the staff. There was no way to confirm it for sure. No blood test. No photo evidence. Just the look in TMU's eyes and the weight of her own memory. But she didn't need proof. The connection was clear. TMU began to explore more of the enclosure. He grew bolder with each day. He climbed higher, played longer, and started responding to the sounds around him. The caretakers started training sessions to help him adjust, and he followed directions easily. They were surprised by how quickly he adapted. Helen watched from a distance. She didn't step in, didn't take over. This time, she let the younger staff lead. But whenever she passed by, TMU walked over and sat by the glass, watching her until she moved on. One day, as Helen sat near the edge of the yard, TMU walked to the front of the enclosure and placed his hand on the glass. Just like Banta had done all those years ago. Helen stood up slowly and walked closer. She didn't place her hand against the glass. She just looked at him. His eyes stayed on hers. No fear. No confusion. Just something quiet and steady. Then he stepped back and picked up a small branch, placing it near the glass before turning away. The other caretakers were confused by the gesture. They didn't understand why it mattered. But Helen did. It was the same thing Banta had done the night before he left. Days passed. Then weeks. TMU continued to grow and Helen continued her quiet routine. She didn't try to relive the past. She didn't try to force a new bond. But she showed up every day. She sat in her same spot. And TMU never forgot to greet her. Sometimes at night, she would think about the herd that came through the trees. The way Banta had led them. The way he had stopped at the fence without fear. She would picture his eyes, older, wiser, but still familiar. And she would remember the feeling of standing still in front of him, knowing in her heart that he hadn't returned by mistake. He had chosen that moment. He had brought TMU there. And he had trusted Helen one more time. That kind of trust didn't come often. Not in a world like this. Not from a wild animal. Not after so many years apart. But it had come. And now it had stayed. TMU's progress continued without trouble. He moved through the enclosure with ease now, climbed the tallest structures, and swung from the ropes with confidence. His body had grown stronger, his movements quicker, and his eyes brighter. The staff praised how easily he adapted. They said he was one of the calmest rescues they'd ever worked with. Helen listened, nodded, and kept her thoughts to herself. She still visited him every morning, just as she had done with Bantu. She never missed a day. Even when her legs ached or the weather turned cold, she made her way down the trail, walked the same path, and stood by the same spot. TMU always noticed her. He would stop whatever he was doing and walk over to the glass. Sometimes he brought a stick. Other times he simply sat and stared. The other staff had started to notice the pattern. One asked her why TMU acted differently around her. Helen didn't have an answer she could give. She only said some animals remember more than we think. Most didn't question her after that. One afternoon, while Helen sat on the bench outside his enclosure, a soft knock came from behind. It was one of the younger caretakers holding a notebook. He asked if Helen could help train a new volunteer who would be working with primates. Helen smiled and agreed. She stood up slowly and followed him back to the office. Later that evening, Helen returned to the enclosure. TMU had already eaten and was sitting in the corner near the climbing logs. When he saw her, he walked to the glass and sat down. Helen knelt slowly, careful with her knees, and looked at him. They stayed like that until the sun dipped behind the trees. Then she stood and gave a small wave. TMU didn't move. He just watched as she turned and walked back toward the cabin. That night, Helen didn't sleep well. Her hip had started to bother her again, and she moved slowly through the kitchen the next morning. She boiled water for tea and looked out the window. Birds flew past. The sky was cloudy. She didn't rush. She knew the walk would take longer today. When she arrived at the enclosure, TMU was already waiting. He stood close to the glass, not moving until she got there. When she sat down, he tapped the glass gently once, then sat down too. Helen smiled. She didn't speak. She just stayed. A few days later, something unusual happened. A visitor group passed by the sanctuary. Among them was a scientist who had worked with the original reintroduction program. He was older now, walking with a cane, and wore a wide hat that covered most of his face. When he saw TMU, he froze. He asked Helen if the gorilla was part of any recent program. She told him he had arrived with a small group that appeared one morning but that the others had returned to the wild. The man stared at TMU a long time before turning to Helen and asking if she remembered a gorilla named Bantu. She said she did. The man said Bantu had become one of the most successful releases in the program's history. He had formed a small group, stayed far from human settlements, and avoided all conflict. He was rarely seen. Rangers had only spotted him a few times over the years. But every report described him the same way: calm, strong, and watchful. Helen listened quietly. The man went on to say that once, near one of the forest watch posts, a ranger saw Bantu watching from a ridge. Behind him were 3 younger gorillas. One of them had a scar on his arm. Helen didn't speak. She didn't have to. The man closed his notebook and nodded. Then he said something simple. Sometimes they come back. Helen looked at TMU, who was still sitting by the glass, waiting. Later that day, Helen walked the long trail behind the sanctuary. It led to a clearing where the trees opened up and sunlight broke through in strips. She hadn't walked this far in a while, but today felt like a day for remembering. She stood in the clearing for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the wind move through her hair. Somewhere beyond those trees, Bantu had walked once. Maybe he still did. But even if she never saw him again, it didn't matter. He had already returned, in the quiet shape of a young gorilla with steady eyes and a familiar scar. And that was enough. Spring turned to summer and the sanctuary grew louder with life. Birds nested near the roofs. The wind moved through the high branches like a quiet river. Visitors came and went, and the staff stayed busy caring for the animals. But for Helen, time moved slower. Each morning felt like its own chapter now. She didn't walk fast, didn't carry heavy things, and didn't try to do more than her body allowed. But she still showed up. Always. TMU had grown taller. His steps were heavier now. His arms longer. His eyes, though still soft, now held more strength. He wasn't a baby anymore. The younger staff joked that he would soon outgrow the enclosure. Helen smiled but said nothing. She knew what came next. One day they would begin talking about the forest again. About whether TMU should be released. About whether he was ready. She wasn't afraid of that day. Not anymore. One morning, she brought a blanket and sat by the enclosure longer than usual. TMU came close, sat near the glass, and stayed with her. Neither moved. A few caretakers passed by and smiled, but no one interrupted. The sun rose high and the trees gave off a sharp pine smell. Helen closed her eyes for a moment and just listened. Later that day, she walked to the old file room. Dust covered the shelves. Folders leaned against one another, filled with years of reports, charts, and handwritten notes. She found the drawer with Bantu's name. It hadn't been opened in a long time. She looked through the papers slowly, flipping past medical records, feeding logs, and early photos. At the bottom was a note she had written herself years ago. Just a short line, no details. It said, "First time he reached out." She remembered that moment. How small the gesture had been. A quiet offering of fruit. A single act of trust that had meant everything. She put the file back and closed the drawer. That evening, a group of students visited the sanctuary. They stood in front of TAMU's enclosure, whispering and pointing. One of the teachers told them about Helen. How she had cared for the animals since the beginning. How some animals remembered her even after years in the wild. The students asked if that was true. Helen didn't speak right away. Then she simply said that animals never forget kindness. Not really. Even when they leave, some part of them remembers who stood beside them when it mattered most. The teacher nodded and led the group away. Later that week, a new report arrived from a nearby reserve. A large male gorilla had been seen again near the western hills. Calm. Unbothered by the rangers. He had passed by without trouble. It had been years since the last sighting. But the description was clear: strong, wide shoulders, thick coat, and slow, careful steps. No one said the name. But Helen knew. The next morning, Helen woke before the sun. The sky outside her window was still dark. She lit a small lamp and made her tea. Her hands moved slower now. Her back ached. But her heart felt steady. She sat by the window and looked out toward the trees. A little later, she walked to the sanctuary one more time. TMU was waiting by the glass as he always did. Helen sat down. They stayed like that for a long while, not speaking, not moving. Just breathing the same air. Then she stood up, gave a small nod, and turned to leave. As she walked away, TMU placed a leaf near the glass and stepped back. The gesture needed no explanation. It was the same gift Bantu had given years ago. A sign of trust. A quiet thank you. That night, Helen sat on her porch as the sun went down. The air was warm. The wind soft. She watched the trees sway gently and closed her eyes for a while. Somewhere out there, in the deep forest, a silverback lived his life with quiet pride. And just beyond the fence, his legacy was safe. Not just in the eyes of the young gorilla left behind, but in the heart of the woman who had never stopped believing. If you loved this story, like the video and subscribe for a surprise tomorrow.